The thing about apex predators, the galaxy had decided approximately 3,000 years ago, was that they always looked like apex predators. This was a comfort, a logical, reasonable comfort that allowed civilized species to sleep soundly in their climate-controlled habitats, knowing that evolution had been kind enough to label the dangerous things with appropriate warning signs. The Krell had their chitinous armor and mandibles that could shear through steel. The Thoraxians stood 9 feet tall with retractable claws and a roar that could rupture eardrums at 50 paces. Even the relatively docile Vryn had those unsettling triple-jointed limbs and the kind of teeth that suggested their ancestors hadn't always been vegetarian by choice. Humans, by contrast, looked like someone had taken a predator, sanded off all the interesting bits, and then wrapped it in the galaxy's most disappointingly average packaging. This was the prevailing wisdom aboard the DSV Harmonious Exchange, a Prosperity Union diplomatic vessel that was, at this particular moment, carrying approximately 400 souls through the relatively safe shipping lanes of the outer Tertius sector. The ship itself was a monument to bureaucratic optimism, sleek where it should have been armored, spacious where it should have been practical, and painted in the kind of serene blues and whites that screamed, "Please don't shoot us, we're here to talk about trade agreements." The Harmonious Exchange was captained by Vrex Thalanis, a Quillian who had ascended to his position through a combination of political acumen, 3 decades of unblemished service, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously threatened in one's entire life. Quillians were tall, graceful beings with iridescent feather crests and 4 arms that made them exceptional at multitasking and terrible at understanding species who couldn't juggle their workload quite so literally. Vrex had kind eyes, a soothing voice that made subordinates feel heard, and absolutely no combat experience whatsoever. His second-in-command was Kolrath, a Bronthan whose species had evolved on a high-gravity world that made them dense, stocky, and nearly impossible to knock over. Kolrath had the temperament of a boulder and roughly the same level of imagination. He was loyal, competent at following procedures, and had once described an emergency drill as unnecessarily exciting. The rest of the command crew was a typical Prosperity Union mix. A Silthine navigator, whose translucent skin made her look like a walking mood ring. A Hrevek engineer who communicated primarily in clicks and somehow kept the ship running despite its design flaws. And a Vespid tactical officer who took his job seriously despite the fact that the Harmonious Exchange had all the tactical capability of a particularly aggressive filing cabinet. And then there was the human. Her name was Mira Castellanos, though most of the crew just called her the human in the same tone one might use for the photocopier or the plant in the corner that someone keeps forgetting to water. She was small by galactic standards, barely 5.5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, brown eyes that seemed perpetually sleepy, and the kind of soft features that made her look approximately 12 years old by most species standards. Her job was listed as cultural liaison and xenobiological consultant, which was bureaucratic speak for the person we keep around to explain human things when they come up in negotiations. Mostly, she filed reports, smiled politely at jokes she'd heard 17 times before, and drank an alarming amount of coffee from a thermos covered in stickers with incomprehensible human humor. "Decaf is a war crime," one read. "I'm not short, I'm fun-sized," declared another. The crew found these charming in the way one finds a child's drawings charming, mildly amusing, but ultimately inconsequential. Mira had been aboard for 8 months. In that time, she had proven herself to be unfailingly polite, remarkably patient with condescension, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to remain cheerful in the face of the universe's most boring meetings. She laughed at herself easily, never raised her voice, and had a habit of apologizing for taking up space. The crew liked her the way one likes a particularly agreeable houseplant. No one, not even Vrex, with his decades of diplomatic experience, had ever thought to wonder what might be hiding behind those sleepy brown eyes. The galaxy, as it turned out, was about to receive a rather pointed education on the subject. The pirates called themselves the Cravathi Marauders, which sounded impressive right up until you learned that Cravathi roughly translated to very angry in their native tongue, suggesting a certain lack of creativity in the naming department. What they lacked in branding, however, they made up for in violence, efficiency, and a profitable business model built on the simple principle that diplomatic vessels were soft targets full of valuable cargo and even more valuable hostages. Their ships came screaming out of FTL like bats out of hell. Assuming hell was a particularly aggressive fire sale and the bats were heavily armed corvettes with the aesthetic sensibility of a junkyard crossed with a death metal album cover. There were 5 of them, each bristling with weapons that had absolutely no business being on vessels that size. And they moved with the kind of coordination that suggested this wasn't their first robbery. The harmonious exchange detected them approximately 4 seconds before the first warning shot vaporized a communications array. "Captain!" The Vespid tactical officer's voice cracked across the bridge, his antennae vibrating with alarm. 5 bogies, Cravathi configuration, weapons hot. Vrex's feather crest flattened against his skull. The Quillian equivalent of someone's face going pale. "Hail them. Perhaps this is a misunderstanding." The second shot took out their primary thruster. "I'm going to call that a no on the misunderstanding front." Kolrath rumbled, his dense fingers already working the emergency protocols. "Shields are up, but they won't last long. These things are built for hugging, not fighting." "Distress beacon?" Vrex managed, his forearms working different controls with the desperation of someone trying to stop a sinking ship by bailing with teacups. "Already sent. Nearest Prosperity Union patrol is 6 hours away." The Silthine navigator's skin flashed crimson with stress. "We have approximately 6 minutes before they finish disabling our engines and board us." The bridge descended into controlled chaos, the kind of controlled chaos that was really just regular chaos wearing a professional name tag. Alarms blared. Status screens flashed angry red. The ship shuddered as another impact rocked the hull, sending crew members grabbing for support. Mira had been sitting at her little corner station, reviewing a particularly tedious report on human agricultural exports, when the first shot hit. Her coffee thermos tipped over, spilling the last of her morning fuel across a data pad. She stared at the spreading brown stain for a moment, her expression unchanging. Then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no glowing aura, no sudden burst of power. But if anyone had been paying attention, which they weren't, because they were all rather busy panicking, they would have noticed that Mira's posture changed. Her shoulders straightened, her head tilted slightly, and those sleepy brown eyes suddenly looked a lot less sleepy and a lot more focused. She stood up, leaving the spilled coffee where it was, and walked toward the command cluster with a kind of deliberate calm that looked wildly out of place on a ship that was actively being shot at. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising clarity. "What's our tactical status?" Vrex spared her a glance, his expression somewhere between incredulous and too busy to care. "Mira, please return to your station and secure yourself. This is a crisis situation." "Yes, I noticed the being shot at part," Mira interrupted, which was probably the first time in 8 months she'd interrupted anyone. "That's why I'm asking about our tactical status. Do we have weapons? Point defense? Anything? The Vespid tactical officer chittered something that might have been a laugh or might have been hysteria. We have 2 plasma turrets rated for asteroid deflection and a cargo bay full of diplomatic gifts. Unless you think we can weaponize ceremonial fruit baskets. The plasma turrets. Where are they controlled from? Secondary weapons station, but they're useless against military-grade shields. Mira was already moving. She crossed the bridge with quick, efficient steps, sliding into the weapons station chair and pulling up displays with a kind of familiarity that made several crew members blink in confusion. Mira, what are you? Rex started. Buying us time. Her fingers flew across the controls with speed that definitely didn't match her usual hunt and peck typing style. Kolrath, I need you to vent plasma from the port coolant system on my mark. Navigator, spin us 15 degrees starboard and kill forward momentum. Why would we? Kolrath began. Because I asked nicely, and because we have about 90 seconds before they finish their boarding approach. Mira's voice had changed. It was still polite, technically, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made it less of a request and more of a statement about how reality was going to unfold. Captain, with respect, either trust me or watch them crack this ship open. Your call. Rex stared at her for a long moment. Then, because he was a good captain and because he genuinely had no better options, he nodded. Do what she says. What happened next would later be described in the after-action report as tactically unorthodox and possibly insane. And how did she even know that would work? The harmonious exchange spun, venting superheated plasma in a cloud that blossomed across their port side, just as 2 Cravathi corvettes moved in for docking. The plasma cloud obscured sensors and forced the pirates to veer off. In that moment of confusion, Mira fired both asteroid defense turrets. Not at the ships, which would have been useless, but at the plasma cloud itself. The superheated gas ignited. It wasn't an explosion, not really. It was more of a very aggressive cough that sent both pirate ships tumbling, their shields overloading from the thermal shock. It bought them maybe 2 minutes. Mira used every second. They'll compensate and come in from 3 vectors next time, she said, her voice absolutely calm in a way that was starting to creep out the bridge crew. We can't stop them, but we can make the boarding expensive enough that they'll think twice about keeping at it. How? Rex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira turned to look at him, and for the first time, the captain of the Harmonious Exchange saw something in her expression that made his feather crest stand on end. She smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. We give them what they want. We let them board. The thing about humans that the galaxy consistently failed to understand, despite having 3 full decades of diplomatic relations to figure it out, was that they were really, really good at pattern recognition. Not in the fun way, like solving puzzles or playing strategic games, but in the deeply unsettling way where they could look at a situation and immediately extrapolate 7 different ways it could kill them, and 17 ways they could kill it first. Mira had spent 8 months aboard the Harmonious Exchange, doing nothing more threatening than filing reports and smiling politely. She had also spent those 8 months memorizing every corridor, every access panel, every system junction, and every potential choke point on the ship. Not because she was paranoid, though she was, by galactic standards, incredibly paranoid, but because that's just what humans did. You got on a ship, you learned the ship, and you figured out how you'd fight your way out if things went wrong. It was practically instinct. The Cravathi pirates finally managed their boarding action approximately 4 minutes after their first attack. They came in hard through the cargo bay. cutting through the outer door with plasma torches and flooding in with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from having done this dozens of times before. There were 20 of them in the first wave. Cravathi themselves were nasty pieces of work, reptilian species with scales like armor plating and enough natural weapons to make a Thoraxian jealous. They carried rifles that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts and rage. And they moved with the coordination of a professional military unit that had gone freelance for moral and financial reasons. They expected resistance. Some stations had security teams, some crews had a few combat-capable members. Standard procedure was to make a show of force, break a few heads, and watch everyone else surrender. What they did not expect was for the cargo bay lights to cut out 30 seconds after they breached. "Night vision!" The lead pirate snarled, his translator making his voice sound like gravel being ground in a blender. "Standard sweep formation. Watch for..." The first pirate died when a cargo container weighing approximately 3 tons fell on him from above. The second died when the chain holding that container, which definitely shouldn't have been loose enough to fall, whipped around and caught him across the throat with enough force to decapitate him. The rest of the boarding party opened fire at shadows, their muzzle flashes illuminating the cargo bay in strobing snapshots of chaos. They were shooting at nothing. The containers had been rearranged, creating a maze where there should have been clear sight lines. Their thermal imaging showed heat signatures everywhere, dozens of them, scattered throughout the bay. Most of them were heating elements pulled from food storage units. 3 of them were crew members who'd been too slow to evacuate. One of them was Mira. She moved through the darkness like she'd been born in it, her soft shoes making no sound on the deck plating. Everything about her body language had changed. The apologetic posture was gone. The sleepy expression had been replaced by something focused and calculating, and deeply, viscerally frightening to anything with survival instincts. The pirates were hunters. They'd been hunters their entire lives. They knew what it felt like to be the thing doing the hunting. This was different. This was what it felt like to be prey. Mira had armed herself from the emergency lockers, not with the ceremonial plasma pistols that the ship's token security team carried, but with a maintenance pry bar, a roll of industrial adhesive tape, and a ceramic knife from the galley. In the hands of most species, these would have been improvised weapons at best. In her hands, they became very efficient ways to end lives. She dropped from an overhead pipe onto a pirate's back, the pry bar hooking around his throat and leveraging his own armor against him. He went down choking. She was already moving, rolling behind cover as return fire chewed up the space where she'd been standing. The ceramic knife flashed out, severing a hydraulic line. Pressurized fluid sprayed, and in the confusion, she was on the next pirate. The tape wrapping around his rifle muzzle and his throat in one smooth motion. The galaxy's sophisticated species had forgotten something important. Humans didn't evolve with claws or fangs or armor plating. They evolved with hands and brains and the kind of relentless, creative violence that came from being a species that hunted mammoths by running them to death over the course of 3 days. They were tool users. Everything was a weapon. Everything was leverage. And they never, ever stopped moving forward. The pirates' formation broke. They started shooting at each other. In the darkness and chaos, with their squad members dropping one by one to an enemy they couldn't see or track, their discipline evaporated. They fell back toward the cargo bay entrance, trying to regroup. Mira let them go. Not out of mercy, but because she'd already moved on to the next problem. The second boarding team came through the starboard airlock 8 minutes later. They'd learned from the first team's screaming radio chatter and came in with proper lighting, chemical smoke to scatter thermal signatures, and enough firepower to level a small building. They made it approximately 30 feet into the ship before the bulkhead door, which should have been locked open per safety regulations, slammed shut behind them, and the corridor ahead sealed as well. They were trapped in a 60-foot section of corridor with no cover. "Blow the doors," the team leader shouted. That's when the atmosphere vents opened and started pumping the air out. Cravathi could survive in vacuum for maybe 90 seconds if they were lucky. These pirates had about 45 seconds before they'd start suffering permanent damage. They scrambled for their helmets, trying to seal their suits, while simultaneously trying to breach the doors. They were still trying when Mira opened the emergency access panel behind them and tossed in 3 fire suppression grenades. The foam filled the corridor in seconds, flash freezing in the near vacuum and encasing the pirates like insects in amber. They weren't dead, yet. But they also weren't going anywhere. Mira sealed the panel behind her and continued moving through the access tunnels. Her breathing steady, her expression focused. Behind her, emergency systems automatically restored atmosphere to the corridor, and medical alerts started pinging for the trapped pirates. She'd stopped the immediate threat. Now she needed to stop the ships outside from sending more. The thing that really bothered Captain Vrex, as he watched the security feeds from the relative safety of the sealed bridge, was how calm she looked. Pirates were screaming, fighting, dying, and the small human woman was moving through it all with the expression of someone doing a mildly tedious chore. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She looked focused in the way a surgeon might look focused, or a craftsman working on a particularly intricate piece. "Captain," Colrath said quietly, his voice unusually subdued. "What are we looking at?" "I don't know," Vrex admitted, "but I'm very glad she's on our side." On the feeds, Mira had reached one of the external airlocks. She was working on something with components pulled from an access panel, her hands moving with quick efficiency. After a moment, she opened a communication channel to the bridge. "Captain, I need you to hail the pirate ships." "What? Why?" "Because I'm about to give them a very strong incentive to leave, and it'll work better if they know exactly what's happening." Vrex exchanged glances with his crew, then opened the channel. "This is Captain Vrex Thalanis of the Harmonious Exchange. To whom am I speaking?" The response was immediate and furious. "This is Commander Shakril of the Cravathi Marauders. You've killed 15 of my crew, Captain. You're going to listen." Mira's voice cut in, broadcast on the same channel. "Check your sensors. Airlock 7, port side." There was a pause. Then, That's one of our breaching pods. What have you attached to it?" "Your breaching pod's fuel cell, reconfigured as a bomb. It's currently aimed at your flagship's bridge using your own docking clamps as a mount. The detonator is linked to my biometrics. If I stop being alive, it goes off. If anyone tries to disarm it, it goes off. If you try to detach it, it goes off." The silence on the other end was profound. Mira continued, her voice still perfectly calm. "You have 30 seconds to break off your attack and clear the area. Every 10 seconds you're still here, I'm going to activate another improvised weapon. I have 7 of them positioned around your ships. After 7, I start getting creative with your own munitions." "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "Because I'm looking at your personnel manifest that I pulled from your computer during the boarding. Really should encrypt those better, by the way. And I'm seeing that you have approximately 200 crew members across all 5 ships. I've already killed or incapacitated 20. That's 10% of your force in under 15 minutes. How many more are you willing to lose to find out if I'm bluffing?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "This isn't over, human." "Yes, it is. Because if you ever come back, I won't give you 30 seconds. I'll just blow your ships and spend the rest of my day doing paperwork. Now leave." The Kravati ships disengaged. They didn't leave gracefully. There was a lot of aggressive posturing and a few warning shots fired into empty space. But they left. The harmonious exchange, still venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches and listing slightly to port, was suddenly alone in the darkness. On the bridge, no one said anything for a long moment. Then Vrex cleared his throat. Someone should probably check on the human. They found Mira in the cargo bay, sitting on a container and drinking from an emergency water pouch. She was covered in various substances that no one wanted to examine too closely. Her hair had come loose from its ponytail. There was a nasty bruise forming on her left cheek. She looked up as the command crew entered, her expression shifting back to something that resembled her usual mild demeanor. "Oh, hey. Sorry about the mess. I'll help clean up once medical clears me." Vrex approached slowly, his feather crest flat with a combination of fear and confusion. "Mira, what? How did you—" She tilted her head. "How did I what? How did you do all of this?" He gestured vaguely at the cargo bay, at the unconscious pirates being tended by medical teams, at the improvised weapons and the general chaos. Mira looked genuinely confused. "I just did what needed doing. I mean, they were going to rob us and probably sell us as hostages. Seemed like a situation that required handling. But you're a cultural liaison. Your file says you have no combat training." "Oh no, I have tons of combat training. 4 years of military service before I went into diplomatic work." She paused. "Did I not mention that? I feel like that should have come up during the hiring process." "It most certainly did not." "Huh. Weird. Yeah, no, I was a combat engineer. Specialization in hostile boarding actions and urban warfare. Did a tour on 3 different stations, dealt with pirate attacks, smuggling interdictions, the usual." She said this with the same casual tone one might use to discuss a previous job in retail. "Is that going to be a problem? Because honestly, I really like the filing work. It's peaceful, very low stress." The Silthine navigator's skin was flashing through colors that didn't exist on any known emotional spectrum. You killed 15 sentients in hand-to-hand combat, and you're calling filing work low stress?" "Well, yeah. Filing never shoots back." Mira stood up, wincing slightly. "Anyway, I should probably get to medical. I think I cracked a rib during the thing with the cargo container, and we should check those hull breaches before we lose any more atmosphere. I can help with the repairs if—" "Mira." Vrex held up all 4 hands in a gesture of surrender. "Please go to medical. We will handle the repairs. And then we're going to have a very long conversation about your personnel file." "Cool. Can I grab my coffee first? I really need caffeine after all this." She walked past them, leaving the command crew standing in the cargo bay, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Kolrath was the first to speak. "I'm going to need therapy." "Get in line," the Vespid tactical officer muttered. The after-action report took 3 days to compile, mostly because Vrex kept deleting sections that made him sound insane, and then adding them back in because they were technically accurate. The Prosperity Union's response was swift and multifaceted. They promoted Vrex for his quick thinking, reprimanded the entire crew for not properly vetting personnel files, sent a salvage team for the disabled pirate vessels, and most importantly, opened an investigation into exactly what else they might have missed about humans. The investigation lasted approximately 6 months and resulted in a comprehensive review of human capabilities that caused several senior officials to take extended stress leave. The findings were concerning. Humans, it turned out, had been playing down their combat capabilities for 3 decades. Not maliciously. They genuinely considered themselves a peaceful species and meant it sincerely. It's just that their definition of peaceful was calibrated against a historical record that included 2 world wars, countless smaller conflicts, and a pre-space flight period that could generously be described as enthusiastically violent. They'd evolved on a death world. Not one of the really scary death worlds where everything was actively trying to kill you every second, but a solidly mid-tier death world where death was more of a persistent possibility than an immediate certainty. This had produced a species that was simultaneously creative, adaptable, and capable of extreme violence when motivated. The galaxy had looked at human soft bodies, lack of natural weapons, and generally pleasant demeanor, and concluded they weren't dangerous. This was like looking at a coiled spring and concluding it wasn't dangerous because it was just sitting there. The problem was what happened when you pressed on it. Mira returned to her duties after a week of medical leave and mandatory psychological evaluation. The evaluation was interesting, mainly because the psychologist kept asking her if she felt traumatized by the violence. And Mira kept explaining that, no, actually, she felt pretty good about successfully protecting her crewmates. And wasn't that the normal response? The psychologist, a Thorellian whose species had evolved as herd prey animals, had needed his own psychological support after that session. The crew's relationship with Mira changed after the incident. They weren't afraid of her exactly. She was still the same polite, cheerful person she'd always been. But there was a new awareness, a subtle caution in how they interacted with her. They'd seen what she was capable of when the pleasant mask came off, and they couldn't quite forget it. Mira, for her part, seemed genuinely oblivious to the change. She went back to filing reports, drinking alarming amounts of coffee, and apologizing when she took up too much space in meetings. The only real difference was that she started helping with combat drills, and the ship's emergency response time improved by 40%. She also added a new sticker to her thermos. "Underestimate me. That'll be fun." The Cravathi marauders never bothered the harmonious exchange again. In fact, word spread fairly quickly through pirate circles that the ship with the small human cultural liaison was to be avoided at all costs. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, until Mira became a sort of boogeyman figure. The human who'd single-handedly destroyed a boarding party with improvised weapons and no backup. The truth, as Mira would explain to anyone who asked, was much simpler. She'd been trained to handle hostile situations. The pirates had been kind enough to attack in a predictable pattern. And really, anyone could do what she'd done if they'd thought it through properly. This explanation never made anyone feel better. If anything, it made things worse, because it implied that what they'd witnessed wasn't even particularly impressive by human standards. The galaxy was slowly, uncomfortably, beginning to realize that humanity's 3 decades of peaceful cooperation hadn't been a sign of weakness. It had been a sign of choice. Humans could be violent, terrifyingly, efficiently violent. They just preferred not to be. Which was, in its own way, much more frightening than if they'd been violent all along. Captain Vrex, sitting in his ready room 3 months after the incident, stared at his revised personnel file for Mira Castellanos. It now included her complete military service record, her combat certifications, her psychological evaluations, all of which described her as stable and well-adjusted in a way that somehow made it worse. And a note from Human Resources explaining that, yes, they'd known about all of this. And yes, they should have mentioned it. And no, they didn't think it was relevant to a cultural liaison position. He took a long drink of Quillian brandy and contemplated the universe's sense of humor. Outside his window, the stars wheeled by in their familiar patterns, uncaring and eternal. Somewhere out there, the galaxy continued its comfortable existence, most of it still blissfully unaware that humanity was playing a very long game of, let's all just get along, while being fully capable of playing something much more violent, if circumstances required. Vrex thought about Mira, currently probably in her quarters, drinking coffee and watching human entertainment that consisted of people doing inadvisable things and laughing about it. He thought about how she'd smiled when offering to let pirates board. He thought about that new sticker on her thermos. Underestimate me. That'll be fun. He took another drink. The thing about apex predators, he reflected, wasn't that they always looked dangerous. The really scary ones, the truly terrifying ones, were the ones that looked harmless right up until the moment they weren't. Humans had spent 3 decades looking harmless. Vrex was starting to think that might have been the most dangerous thing about them all along. Somewhere in the crew quarters, Mira sneezed, shrugged, and went back to watching her show. It was a comedy about a human who kept accidentally stumbling into dangerous situations and having to fight their way out. She found it hilarious in a deeply relatable way.